Welcome to the War Academy channel. When looking at World War II, one often tends to speculate about things that could have happened but never did. Perhaps one of the most famous examples is the assertion that Germany should have made many more tanks of simpler and cheaper models, without taking into account the available fuel, the shortage of ammunition, or the lack of properly trained crews. Another cliché is to affirm that certain operations such as the one in the Ardennes or Lake Balaton should not have been launched, or even go so far as to say that a certain general was wrong with the decisions he made. And finally, another very recurring issue that continues to be debated a lot is that of the defensive strategies that were carried out during the last battles. If we take these points into account, many people even today might think that the war could have dragged on indefinitely if the Germans had held firm on the Rhine and Oder rivers. This is undoubtedly a very simplistic analysis that ignores one of the fundamental facts of the Second World War, and that is that from the end of 1941, the conflict became a war of attrition. There are those who can even advance or delay this date, but we will take what we have just said as a guide. With that said, let's move on to the next question. If the German army had been able to effectively blockade its enemies on the Rhine and the Oder, would Germany have remained active in the war for a long time? Had they been able to last a few more months, could they have developed the famous miracle weapons? We will see the answer to this below, and it is emphatically no. Of course, and I am the first to admit that with another type of general and another type of strategy, the end would have come later, but not for much longer than it did. The first thing we have to take into account to begin our analysis is that the Germany of the first months of 1945 was full of refugees who had abandoned their homes as the Allied advanced. Additionally, millions of people inside Germany were homeless because they had been destroyed by Allied aircraft. To this we have to add the railway collapse, which little by little made it more difficult to transport goods and people from one place to another, within the increasingly smaller Third Reich. Finally, morale was at rock bottom, despite the attempts to raise it by Goebbels or some generals such as Model or Schorner. The news that the refugees brought about what was happening in their territory, or the thousands of soldiers who withdrew from everywhere, completely ruined, announced the worst. Although an attempt was made to avoid this contagion by word of mouth, trying to isolate part of the population that came from certain places on the Eastern Front, or continuous warnings were sent to the soldiers not to transmit these types of stories, in the end it was impossible to control it. Dated March 3, 1945, Goebbels noted the following in his diary. "It is significant that the Reuters agency has published today in London that our situation is not as catastrophic as it may seem. It is said that we can still make enough weapons and that our human potential is not exhausted at all. That is why one cannot speak of a near end to the war. The latest blows have not affected the heart of Germany. Reuters sees that we are only facing considerable difficulties in the supply sector, which is in fact true. Probably in the next 3 or 4 months we have to reckon with the most extreme crisis here." In these words, Goebbels is admitting that the most worrying thing during the next few months in Germany will not be the lack of ammunition, fuel, or weapons, but the lack of food. And this is one of the factors that are never taken into account. With a growing refugee and unproductive population within cramped Germany, the mouths to feed grew larger. To this we have to add that Germany had lost all her allies, as well as the occupied territories from which she got raw materials. This means that Germany had to settle for what little it could produce, since it could not obtain any type of resource that came from outside. This shortage had progressively led to food having to be rationed, which was causing greater discomfort. Let us remember that one of the situations that the German government wanted to avoid from the outset was that its population suffered scarcity and hardship, since they knew that it had been one of the main reasons for their defeat during the First World War. However, it was mainly from the summer of 1944 when, irremediably, the German population began to suffer the direct effects of the war, among which we do not count those of the Allied bombers, since these inconveniences had been dragging them to more than 1 year. It was specifically on August 24, 1944, when the standard of living that the Germans had been able to maintain hitherto sank completely. That day, the The chaotic situation that was being experienced on both the Eastern and Western fronts led to the closure of theaters, cabarets, cinemas, and dramatic schools that were still open. The working week was extended to 60 hours and vacations were temporarily abolished. The power and water cuts were little by little more frequent and the food was of increasingly poor quality. This led to part of the civilian population beginning to suffer from malnutrition problems, which added to all the concerns about the war and bombing. In summary, from this moment leisure was practically eliminated, working hours increased, and the food received as well as all kinds of services began to be reduced. All this did nothing but reduce German morale to very worrying levels, which propaganda minister Goebbels continuously alludes to in his diary, as we saw in the program we did especially about him. 1 month after the entry we have just seen, Goebbels is even more catastrophic in his diary, and on April 1, 1945 he comments on the subject of hunger, which is already happening to part of the German population. Supply is now beginning little by little to become enormously complicated. The latest restrictions have reduced our rations so much that they barely reach the subsistence minimum. It can be imagined that due to all these hard blows that fall on the town, a kind of fatalism breaks out everywhere. People face the approaching disaster as an inevitable phenomenon of nature. Many are already in favor of a horrific ending than of an endless horror. Having seen these declarations of the minister in what is already announced the worst, let us finally see a testimony of the wife of a German soldier, from the end of 1944. This letter that the woman sends to her husband who is fighting, says as follows. The trams don't work, and it looks like a huge plow has flattened the whole city. We have no water or electricity, and the gas is constantly cut off. Food is also scarce and more people are sick. Candlelight can be very endearing at Christmas or at a romantic dinner, but living with it every day makes you feel very lonely and sad. My nerves are totally unhinged, and I can hardly sleep. To this testimony we must add other thoughts, such as knowing if their husbands and children who were at the front were still alive, and if they would see them again when everything was over. Everything formed a cluster of negative emotions that were very difficult to control, and that was increasing every day. This was visible in the queues at the different shops and food distribution points, where more and more tension was building up, causing numerous robberies and riots. The hatred of the civilian population in this final stage went on the one hand towards the German leaders, whom they held responsible for the disaster they were suffering. The criticisms of Hermann Göring are undoubtedly the best example. On the other hand, the population deeply hated the Allies for carrying out such an indiscriminate bombing campaign against them, and for the terrifying stories coming from the Eastern Front. Taking all this into account, the conclusion reached is that World War II in Europe could hardly have lasted more than 1 or 2 months longer than it did, since Germany was exhausted in all aspects and the population had reached the limit. To everything we have just commented on the civilian population, we can add all the orders that the German army itself no longer obeyed when going to support the defense of Berlin, since they gave up the war for lost and considered it totally useless. But well, until here this video in which we have contributed other points of view different from those that are usually given, about the possibilities that Germany had or not to continue prolonging the war. I leave you in the description the program that we uploaded recently about the opinion of the generals of the reasons for their defeat. We say goodbye here. Many thanks to everyone, especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and see you in the next one. See you soon.